So my name is Oluko Antonio Miller. Oluko is a Yoruba word for teacher. So that's pretty much a title I gave myself because I am a teacher. I teach African history in high school. I think it's important to teach that to our youth at that level, um, especially our males, because it gives them a sense of self. And the lecture I have today is on a book by John W. Blessingame. It's called The Slave Community, Plantation Life in the Antebellum South. And this is just a book. It outlines the everyday life of the African slave from a sociological perspective. What was the African response to slavery? Um, you know, the cliche in our community, or what we've been taught for so long, is that African people never fought back. We never resisted slavery, or we resisted, you know, from a minor perspective, or um, we rarely tried. This book is a myth breaker to that. Um, so, I mean, I could get into the first chapter. It's chapter one, which is what I like to call the response to slavery. So, the African responded to slavery like any other human would. He fought it, he resented it, resisted it with every breath and every tactic that he had in his body. What we've learned from historians is that Africans were naturally docile, submissive, and were a people who are destined for slavery. This isn't true. It isn't true at all. So, what I want to look at in the first chapter is just what was the response? What was the African response to slavery? How did Africans respond to their enslavement? Were they docile? Were they submissive? The answer is no. They were very resistant, very rebellious. So, according to European enslavers, there were two types of responses to slavery. The first response was the African who resented slavery. He fought back. Um, he didn't like his condition. And then the second response is the African who pretty much fell in line. He was naturally submissive. He knew his place, and he felt that this is what he was and where he needed to be. The funny thing about that is that what I found funny in the book is that Europeans came up with the justification based off of what they seen. They they took Africans, the first Africans that they kidnapped, came from more of nomadic ethnic groups. Now, when we say nomad, we don't necessarily mean like savage, but a hunter and gatherer group. Groups that fish. They move as they go. They follow their food. They said this group of Africans were the most difficult to enslave. I found that funny. They said the other group of Africans that was easier to enslave were Africans that came from a more advanced ethnic group or a more advanced society. And the justification for that was that these Africans from a more advanced or developed civilization, they were used to a hierarchy, they were used to a social order. Now, on the outside, you may hear it and it's like, okay, I kind of get it, I kind of not. But at the same time, no human being is going to want to be enslaved, no matter what the justification is for that. None. They found that, so with this being said, it's important to study the tribal origins of the first slaves to the extent to which their native culture was involved. The funny part about it is that it wasn't the fact that Africans from more advanced or developed civilizations or societies were used to slavery itself. They were used to the work, agricultural labor. They were used to the labor. A hunter-gatherer is not used to that type of labor. They're not building. They're not, moving around as much as far as like, moving boulders, moving bricks, or, building houses or building roads and pathways and planting, gardens and crops and things like that. Hunter-gatherers, they followed their food. So they were like fishermen, they were hunters. They didn't have time, or they were not used to that. So Europeans used the fact that Africans from more developed societies, they were used to this agricultural labor. They flipped it and they used it against African people and said, well, these people are better slaves. They're used to a hierarchy. What I find funny about this is that as slavery began to develop, the early stages of slavery, they saw that both groups, nomadic Africans and Africans from more advanced and developed societies, they both resisted slavery. The European couldn't wrap his mind around this. He couldn't understand or figure out, why. I thought that the African from the advanced society, I thought he would make the perfect slave. I thought she would be the perfect slave. Now, it's important that we look at this. We look at the fact that, in 1 second, it was not the African's past that affected his dependency on the plantation, but it was more responsible for determining his behavior. It was the interaction between the universal elements of African culture, West African culture, and the institutionalized demands of plantation life, and most importantly, the process of enslavement. So we have to look at what is the process of enslavement. The process of enslavement is the mental and physical drainage, dehumanization, and torture of Africans to put them in a weak, despondent, and submissive state and turn them into slaves. That's what's most key. The African responds to the process of enslavement. It had nothing to do with an African coming from a nomadic group. It had nothing to do with an African coming from, I don't want to use the word more civilized, I'll say more advanced. It had nothing to do with the African coming from a more advanced, ethnic group. What it had to do, so the response to the African response to slavery was solely based upon the process of enslavement. How did he respond to the process of enslavement? Many Africans resisted slavery at every step in their forced migration. With that being said, there were many mutinies. Africans had been resistant since they were being kidnapped. But we have to look at what the responses were. So, analyzing it, we have to look at what is the process of enslavement. I gave the definition, but a better example would have to be how once these Africans were kidnapped, they were forced to walk miles. They were all chained together by like a thick log, and they had to walk hundreds of miles to slave ships, because at this time in Africa, in the I want to say the mid 1600s, early 1600s and late 1500s, Africans had already knew that Europeans were coming into Africa and that they meant no good. With that being said, Europeans would used to have to dock their ships as far away as possible from African societies and kingdoms. When they did this, they would have these captive Africans and they would make them walk hundreds of miles to slave ships. Now, this, depending on how far the ship was, I would say that it pretty much lasted for a period of maybe 1 to 3 days, depending on how far the ship was docked away. from, the kingdoms. So they were walking hundreds of miles without food and without water. This put Africans in a very exhausted and emaciated state. So when we look at it, because the thing I always hear is that, what we say as black people is, why didn't we fight back? How were they able to just come and, just take us? And why didn't we do anything? It wasn't the fact that we were weak or docile or submissive. It was the fact that the process of enslavement is what weighed the African down. Physically, they wore you out physically first. They took your physical fight away. By the time we got to those docks, we're talking about men and women who were losing 40 to 50 pounds in a matter of 1 to 2 days. You lose that much weight, you're going to be weak physically. So many of our ancestors wanted to fight. They physically wanted to fight back, but they were so exhausted, they couldn't. Once at the ship, they were examined by doctors. Doctors would look at their genitals. They would make them cough, make them open their mouths, examine their gums, things like that, their teeth. And Africans that they thought were, quote unquote, healthy or good slaves, valuable slaves, they would brand them and throw them on the ship. Africans who they figured were either too sickly or too weak, they would kill them on the spot or throw them in the sea. So as you can see, the first part of the process of enslavement is already traumatizing. It's already traumatizing. Now, once they got on the ship, they were placed into the hold. And, most of us, we know how it was inside of that hold. You're forced to, you smell foul things. You're seeing foul things. Our ancestors were covered in feces and vomit and blood, urine, put in the bottom of the hole where salt water from the ocean is hitting their skin, taking the flesh off of their bones. And we were placed in these holds, and it did something to us mentally. African people were not used to that type of violence. We have to remember that the Africans who were kidnapped, they were not savages. They came from civilizations. Most were prisoners of war from 1591. And then others were just, prosperous people within their kingdoms. And, I didn't get into the fact of how Europeans tricked many African, kings and leaders and chiefs into participating in the slave trade. They did this with multiple things. They, when you read A Tropical Dependency, you read that most Europeans use alcohol to get certain African kings and chiefs drunk. And then they would have them sign, treaties and contracts that were not in their African language, that they didn't understand, where they were selling their land away. Or they also would come with religion. So it was a multiple, and if not with religion, the part we know the most, they would come with, of course, the guns and the cannons. But anyway, going back to the ship, these conditions were things that African people never had to witness before. The savagery and the brutality of Europeans, of white people, it put Africans in a state of shock. What was this state called? Blessing Game refers to this state of mind as fixed melancholy. And he says that fixed melancholy is a state of mind where African captives became so despondent and mentally insane that they gave up their will to live. This is important to note. we have to understand that if you're not used to something and if you're not used to a certain environment or a certain group of people, and you're placed in that environment or you're placed around that group of people, and the behavior that these people or that's in this environment is violence, brutality, savagery, terrorization, most people are going to respond by going insane. Most of our ancestors just went insane from seeing this. But when you look at fixed melancholy, it was two responses to that as well. So as you can see, the African response to slavery, it was a response within a response within a response. Because when you look at fixed melancholy, some of our ancestors became so mentally insane, they lost their will to live. So they didn't talk, they didn't eat, they didn't move, and their mind became blank. In this state, the African mind was blank, and it became easy to manipulate and control because it was vulnerable in this state. On the flip side of it, some Africans in their state of fixed melancholy, it made them want to fight more. It made them fight more. It made them, like when you look at how slave ships were taken. If you look at Joseph Senque, what the movie Amistad is based upon, seeing these types of things made most of our ancestors fight back. It made most want to take their own lives. So, like I said, there was a response within a response. Most Africans in fixed melancholy, they were despondent. They did lose their will to live. Others may have been, I don't really want to say they were insane, but it drove them to the point of madness where they couldn't take it and they've had enough. And that was their response. Now, many Africans resisted their enslavement at every step of their forced migration. And I said that before. Even when they didn't run away, they showed that they were often uncooperative or obstinate or sullen. The shock from the process of enslavement was crucial in determining the behavior of the African in slavery. So that's something for us to think about. The shock from the process of enslavement determined the African's behavior in slavery. How would the African behave? It depended upon his response to the process of enslavement. Now, as we said, many fought because they felt, I have nothing to lose. I've been kidnapped. Most of my family is gone. So I might as well fight until, maybe my enemies kill me or until I get away. There were also reports from journals and diaries of how once some Africans hit New World soil, they took off running. They may not have knew where they were going, but they knew, I don't want to be stuck amongst people like this. I don't want to be stuck in a condition like this. So they would run off. Now, we also have to look at the fact of how Africans, how did they resist slavery? How? How did they resist the process of enslavement? So the first way, as we've already noted, was that they physically fought back. Some cases they committed suicide. But what about the Africans who fought back and were subdued, or the ones who tried to commit suicide but were not successful, or ones who didn't, physically fight back? What were other ways that they could have fought back? The key way that a lot of Africans fought back is that they never gave up their African culture. African slaves, captives, they never gave up their African culture. And that's something that we have to note. Even if they had to appear like they had forgotten about their culture around their masters and overseers, they never forgot. They never forgot who they were. And this is key to note because this helped them hold, never forgetting who they were and never giving up their African identity. It helped many of our ancestors cope and get through slavery. And we'll see that later in the lecture how holding on to this African identity kept our sanity. Because slavery was a hell of an institution to live in and experience. So by them never giving up their culture or their heritage, they never gave up their language. They would learn just enough to understand slave masters, but that was pretty much it. This is where the broken language of many Africans in America, this is why we talk the way we talk. They call it the vernacular, they call it slang, they call it ebonics. But when you look at it, it's just a mixture of different African languages, and the African trying to interpret the slave master's language, which was English. And this is why we speak the way we speak. Many masters wrote they couldn't even understand, like many masters, overseers, planters, and just white people who wrote accounts of encountering slaves and things like that. They wrote how they couldn't understand certain words, especially as more Africans were imported during the antebellum period because of the high demand of cotton. When they were imported from Africa, more were being imported from Africa than were born in America. And this mixture of African languages and English words got thicker. And when it got thicker, it became more and more difficult for them to understand, for whites to understand. And this is why they called many slaves ignorant. They called them dumb, they called them stupid because they couldn't understand the language. But in reality, no African in slavery was what we call stupid or dumb. If that were the case, we wouldn't be where we are today. So many Africans, they were aware of their condition and they knew this. They knew how they were perceived, and they would play certain roles just to get by on the plantation. But anyway, while most 19th century slaves were born in America, they still kept contact with their African identity in numerous ways. So even after African-born slaves had either passed away or were sold off of plantations, American-born slaves still kept up with their African identity. And the ways they did that was either by listening to newly imported African slaves or listening to their relatives, listening to like their grandparents. Most grandparents had some knowledge of Africa or their African identity and culture, and they would teach the children this. Maintaining this link with their African past was a form of resistance. Many Africans were beat, tortured, mutilated, and even murdered for retaining their African heritage. But it didn't stop them, because as slavery began to develop, so did the slave. And the slave had to understand and know and learn that it's a certain way I must act that's key to my survival. And other than accepting the slaveholder's view of his place in society, the African held on to his African cultural determinants of his status. So, with that being said, to end chapter 1 and go into chapter 2, I would like to say that The African response to slavery was resistance all the way. It was never a sense of submission. It was always a sense of resistance. And the best way the African responded or resisted, rather, the best way the African resisted slavery was to hold on to his African identity, hold on to who he used to be, hold on to who he really is. That was key. That was really important, because I would argue without that, most slaves would have really been in a state of fixed melancholy, would have really been driven to mental illness and being insane. But holding on to that link to the African past and African heritage, it kept some form of sanity. Now, as we go into chapter 2, we understand that we'll understand how this link to the African past maintained a sense of mental tranquility for the slave. So chapter 2 is about slave culture. Now, in my opinion, this is probably one of the biggest chapters that we'll read or that we'll cover, because slave culture was very unique to me. And I actually want to read out of the book, the first sentence about slave culture and what it was. Antebellum black slaves created several unique cultural forms which lightened their burden of oppression, promoted group solidarity, provided ways for verbalizing aggression, sustaining hope, building self-esteem, and often represented areas of life largely free from the control of whites. However oppressive or dehumanizing the plantation was, the struggle for survival was not severe enough to crush all of the slaves' creative instincts. That's amazing to me. And this is a chapter that every time I teach this to my students, they become amazed at this as well. No matter how oppressive, how dehumanizing, how terrorizing slavery may have been, it wasn't enough to crush the creative instinct of the slave. That's amazing. That's amazing to know. So, with this being said, the slave's creative instincts led to him creating a certain type of culture. And this culture helped him cope with what he dealt with on a day-to-day basis. There are 4 elements of slave culture. And the 4 elements are dances, superstition, emotional religion, and folk songs and tales. Now, as we look at each element of slave culture, we'll understand how these elements eventually became American culture. So the first element, dances. Now, dances was just a way for the slave to, test his physical endurance, win praise amongst other slaves, right? And express the slave's inner feelings. So when they dance, most times they wrestle, as we see in Brazil. Out of dances, slaves were actually were training each other to fight with capoeira. The funny part about the dances is that it helped the slave verbalize his aggression. And this is why most of the times the dances became more than just a dance. It became a way to release physical tension. Now, I don't want to say that slaves wanted to hurt other slaves when they danced, because that wouldn't be true. But it was the fact of just, releasing that tension. It may not have been negative toward another slave, but it was the fact of releasing that physical tension you wanted to take out on the master. And the slave quarters is where the slave learned his social interaction skills. So the slave quarters were the most important factor in slave culture. The slave culture, not the slave culture, the slave quarters is where most, or well, most slaves, especially ones that worked in the field, this is where they live. Now the quarters, for the most part, it was private. This is where the slave was able to pretty much kick back, you know, kick back, free his mind, talk amongst other slaves, make fun of his master, mock his master, and crack jokes. See, this is what's most important to know. It's not that we were docile as what has been taught. I hate the fact that that's been taught. Most students like to they tend to ask like, why didn't we do this? Why didn't we do that? And that really bothers me because, when you look at a book like this, you understand that the African slave wasn't as weak as he has been portrayed to be. But, living in the quarters after a day's work, they would joke around. They would make fun of the master. This helped them get through their situation. It helped them cope with it. It's like, being at a job and, you get off of work, you go home to your wife or to your husband, you crack jokes about it. Like, yeah, man, I told him this and woo, 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 woo. This is what they did. This kept their spirits going. The slave quarters also built a sense of group solidarity amongst the slaves. In the quarters, they learned many things. They learned that you never steal from another slave. That was never allowed in slave. That was never allowed. On many plantations, that was the key rule. You never steal from another slave. You can steal from the white man, you can steal from the master because they owe that to you. But you never steal from another slave because he is a product of his condition just as you are. And it's just like it's amazing how a group of people, our people, African people, were taken to be, inferior to another group. Taken to be inferior to another group, and we never submitted to that inferiority. We never submitted to it. Slavery, we can argue that it was supposed to destroy us, but it didn't. It didn't destroy us. It didn't destroy African people. Slavery did not destroy African people the way we think it did. If it destroyed us, it may have impacted us, but as far as destroyed us, it didn't. How were we able, like Blessing Game said, no matter how dehumanizing, how oppressive and depressive the plantation was, it didn't crush our creative instincts. With that being said, the slave always had a sense of faith or hope that his situation would get better. So that's pretty much, dances is kind of self-explanatory. It was just more of a test of physical endurance, a means of winning praise and expressing the slave's inner feelings. And in most cases, practicing and preparing on how to fight off overseers, or slave patrolmen or even slave masters. One key element of slave culture that we're going to move to next would be superstition. Because of their belief in fortune tellers, witches, magic, and conjurers, many of the slaves constructed a psychological defense against total dependence and submission to their masters. This is key to note. We know West African culture have different forms of spirituality. Yoruba, Igbo, Akan, different types of spiritual beliefs and practices. Now, what the slaves did notice is that white people feared the supernatural. And we know that African spirituality is all about the supernatural. When slaves knew, once they learned that the white man was afraid of the supernatural, they used that as a defense mechanism. They used it to their advantage. The conjurer was the most I would argue, was one of the most powerful and significant individuals on the plantation. Reason being is because no matter what the slave master's power was, at the end of the day, he was just a weak, puny white man when it came to the supernatural. Now, why was the conjurer so powerful? What made one slave who practiced superstition, is what they called it? Why was he or she so powerful? Reason being is because he had the ability to control the slaves. Most times he had more influence over the slaves than the master did. The faith in the conjurer was extremely strong. So slaves appealed to them to prevent floggings, cruel treatment of masters, and protection of planters and patrolmen by giving him certain items that he had blessed. So the conjurer, he used this superstition to his advantage, right? Even over the slaves in a positive way, over whites in a negative. Well, I don't want to say negative, but in a manipulative way. He knew how certain herbs and things worked. He knew what certain herbs were used for, what certain herbs can do. An example of the conjurer's power is how he was able to prevent beatings and floggings. Most times if a conjurer was beat or flogged, what he would do is get like a root or some tree bark or some leaves of a certain plant. And he would have the female house slave or other house slaves help him with this, right? What he would do is he would get these herbs or bark or leaves, and he would, in most cases, poison a slave master's child or wife. And when everybody is on the plantation screaming, it's hysterical, people are like, well, what happened? The slave master may have lost his child. The conjurer will walk up to the slave master in front of the entire plantation and will say, because you flogged me, I put a curse on you and your family. Every time you flog me, a child you have will die. This put fear in the white man himself, in the slave master himself. So the conjurer had a lot of privileges that the everyday slave didn't have because the master was afraid of him. In most cases, the master would try to get rid of the conjurer by selling him to another planter or another slave owner. But in most cases, he would be brought back because he has put fear in this slave owner. So the conjurer was a very powerful individual. He also was able to use his wits on white women. He would sell them love potions and they would pay him. And the conjurer ended up, and this is how he was able to raise money and eventually buy his freedom in most cases. So the conjurer was very important because he used this sense of knowing nature against white people. And I think that's powerful to note. And many slaves, not just the conjurer himself as an individual, many slaves used what they called superstition in order to help themselves. William Wells Brown recalled in his narrative that when he got to a Kentucky plantation, the slave master was very cruel. So he was a practicing conjurer. And what he did when they told him this, he went and got some roots from a certain type of, I think it was like a certain plant he got roots from. And he put them in a bag, and he told the slaves to walk around the master's house every morning in a circle. think like 4 times, and point the roots in the direction of the master's house. And the master would become, he would be more polite. When they did this, it happened. So these types of unexplainable events heightened the slaves, like not heightened, but it made the slaves believe in superstition even more, because those were things that couldn't be explained. The supernatural couldn't be explained. Things that just happened, and that was key to note. So the third element of slave culture would be folk songs and tales. So what we can do is talk about the songs first within folk songs and tales, and then we can get to tales. So the songs of the slaves expressed his mood and reality of his oppression. The slaves sang about the proud defiance of the runaway, the courage of black rebels, the stupidity of patrollers, and the heartlessness of slave traders, and sometimes the kindness and many times the cruelty of his master. Now, slaves also sang sarcastically about the actions of their masters. This is what I find not funny but amazing about it, right? These songs were used, and in most cases, they were full of satire. So what they would do is, sing about the master, and it may be an instance where a master may think he calls himself being good to the slave by giving them one day off, and they may sing about something like this. So they use satire, they use sarcasm in their folk songs. In fact, if we have time, I can actually read one really quick. Let's see. I can find one really quick. Which one can I read? So I'm looking in a book. There are plenty of them, and they're making songs about. Okay, here's one. And excuse, I know I'm not gonna sing it the way our ancestors would sing it, but I try to give you an idea. All them pretty girls will be there. Suck the corn before you eat. They will fix it for us rare. Shake the corn, suck the corn before you eat. I know the supper will be big. Suck the corn before you eat. I think I smell a fine roast pig. Shake the corn before you eat. I hope they have some whiskey there. Shake the corn before you eat. So this was just pretty much a song just talking about like the work, or going to a plantation expecting to see different types of women there. So the songs, they consisted of a lot, just pretty much the slaves' reality. But I did want to note the fact of how they put satire and sarcasm in their songs. It was one song that they had. I actually heard Dr. Clark sing this song before. And he said something about how the slave said, my master would free me when he died. And the old man still want it was basically like, okay, it was something about the master said that he would free them. Most masters made promises of freeing the slave when they died. And the slaves made a song basically saying, my master said he would free me when he dies. And the old man is taking too long to go. Basically, like he won't even die. He said he'll free me when he dies, but he won't. You'll find that type of sarcasm and satire within folk songs. These songs are noted for for their qualities in rhythm than their lyrics. And the songs were also paired with dance. Now, what we do find amazing is that while they sang folk songs, they did something called patting juba. Now, patting juba is when the slaves would, if they didn't have musical instruments, because most plantations they banned musical instruments out of fear of resistance and rebellion and revolts, especially the drum. But when the slave didn't have any musical instruments, what he would do is use his body. So he would, hit his knees, hit his shoulder, hit his chest, his stomach, hit his back. So they would use these things. They would use their own body as a musical instrument, and this was referred to as patting juba. So the folk songs were extremely significant for their sarcasm about slave life and their satire about slave masters and slave life itself. Now, what I find with the folk tales is that they were primarily a means of entertainment, but the tales represented the distillation of folk wisdom, and they were used as an instructional tool to teach young slaves how to survive. They were a projection of the slaves' personal experiences, dreams, hopes. Folk tales allowed slaves to express hostility toward their master. They were able to poke fun at him, delineate the workings of the plantation system. Now, when you look at folk tales, you find how slaves used their environment to create stories about their oppression. Many of them being, well, most, if not all, of them being in the South, they compared it to seeing certain animals. So the ones that are most famous are the bear rabbit tales. And it can be argued that slaves came up with these stories with the bear rabbit stories from just seeing how, being out in plowing a forest, or picking cotton, or chopping down some wood. No matter what they were doing, seeing animals like the rabbit outsmart the fox, the bear, the wolf, and they began to compare. They began to see, and they began to compare how the life, the movements and actions of the animals to their situations as slaves. So they would compare themselves as the rabbit. The rabbit would be seen as the weak, helpless creature, but the bear, the fox, and the wolf would be seen as the powerful creature. So the rabbit represented the slaves, and the animals like bears, wolves, and foxes represented the slave master. But what they found in nature, and they put this in their story, is that the animal that was supposed to be weak almost always outsmarted the animal who was supposed to be strong. So they took that and created stories out of this. And with that, they had the Brer Rabbit tales. Brer Rabbit was the character who was always clever, outsmarting his enemies and his foes. Now, the funny part about this is that Brer Rabbit that character type was stolen. And this is when Bugs Bunny came about. Once the Bear Rabbit tales and the folk tales from slavery were rediscovered by historians, you saw the introduction of the Bugs Bunny character. So Bugs Bunny is a copy and imitation of Bear Rabbit. But these are things that we'll never know. They won't teach us these things. If you look at Bugs Bunny, he's almost identical to Bear Rabbit. He outsmarts all of his enemies. He outsmarts all of his enemies when they're trying to eat him, hurt him, kill him. And this is the same thing that Brer Rabbit did. So that's something key to note. But the folk tales, they consisted of that, just pretty much things slaves wanted to do. There was actually a folk tale where a slave talks about how he's a conjurer, right? And he talks about how, and this is within the folktale, he talks about how every night at midnight, he and his son go and they possess the slave master. And they possess him and his wife. And they turn them into bulls. And they ride their backs as if they were bulls and run the slave masters crazy. So these folk tales, they were often used, you know, like Blessing Game said, to teach young slaves how to survive. But for the most part, it was about taking your situation and trying to make something out of it, make something entertaining about it, you know, or to fantasize. It gave them a sense of hope. I would say that all elements of slave culture gave the slave a form of hope. The last would be emotional religion. So emotional religion came from slaves getting told false information about God. And most slave masters, if not all, taught their slaves that God wanted them to be a slave. God permitted the enslavement of African people, and that this was their holy place. Slaves didn't believe that. They couldn't believe that, you know, the creator or the higher being, or that God wanted them to live under such a condition. So what they did is took what slave masters gave them as religion, and they began to create their own forms of religion. And they created their own forms of religion, and they began to personalize God. They made God seem as if not as if God is this far being that couldn't be reached. They made God seem like, how can I say it? They made God a part of them. They made God seem like, you know, a person. I don't want to say person, but a person one could come to and talk about one's frustrations, and, you know, talk about, you know, one's life. Often in narratives, and plenty white accounts can say how slaves were pretty much, they always referred to God when something bothered them, or, you know, when they were frustrated about something. God, please don't let this master come and start talking to me about this and that. They made God as they personified God to make it easier for them to understand. Now, out of emotional religion, there came spirituals. Now, the spirituals reflected the day-to-day experience of the slave, his troubles, and his hopes for freedom. The most important role of the spiritual is that it served as a means of secret communication. In fact, Harriet Tubman was most known for using spirituals to communicate with slaves about escape. Now, many of the spirituals that slaves sung, they longed for freedom in them. And they used spirituals and religion as a means of escape from their present conditions. And that pretty much sums up chapter 2 as far as slave culture. So slave culture was most important because it helped slaves get through their everyday lives of being a slave. That's why it was most important. As we move to chapter 3, it's about the slave family. Now, even though the family had no legal existence in slavery, it was actually the most important survival mechanism for the slave. In his family, the slave found companionship, love, sexual gratification, and sympathetic understandings of his sufferings. Now, the funny part about family, although it had no legal existence in slavery, some slave masters actually allowed family, but only as a means of control. Some slave masters argued, and slave owners rather, they argued that a slave with a family is not a threat because he had more to lose. He would not be a rebellious slave because he had a family to think about. But a single slave was the slave that would rebel. He was the slave that would be trouble or that would cause trouble. Through his family, the slave learned how to avoid punishment, cooperate with other blacks, and maintain his self-esteem. Child rearing was the most important function of the slave family. So the children learned about who they were through slavery. So the slave family is also something key or important to look at. So what we'll do is look at how the African response to enslavement, slave culture, and the slave family kept the African sane during his enslavement, and how this impacted him, and how it helped him be able to cope with the reality of enslavement. So in the final part of the lecture, we'll look at the slave family. So even though the family had no legal existence in the institution of slavery, it was still an important mechanism of survival for the slave. In his family, the slave found companionship, love, sexual gratification, and sympathetic understanding of his sufferings. Although most slave owners didn't allow family at all, some argued that to give a male slave a family of his own, a nuclear family, a wife and children, it kept him more obedient because he didn't want to break his family up. He didn't want to break that bond or union that he had. But the slave owner also argued that a single slave was trouble. And you didn't want trouble on a plantation, you wanted work to get done. So through his family, the slave learned how to avoid punishment, cooperate with other blacks, and maintain his self-esteem. Child rearing was the most important function of the family. Now we look at child rearing. This is how the children were raised during slavery. The child's parents did everything they could. The slave parent did everything they could to cushion the shock of bondage for their children. And what they would do is teach their children values different from what the master tried to instill in them. And they also gave their children self-esteem about their enslavement. So stable family life was longed for by most slaves, but some slave masters refused it. The male slave had no authority over his family. The master controlled the entire family. Even when slave masters would abuse or rape the wives of male slaves, most knew this was dangerous to try to fight back. No, I'm sorry. They knew it was some knew it was dangerous to fight back, but others would kill slave masters for these types of things. So I know we're made to think that, and like I said, in most cases this was true. Some slave husbands didn't do anything to protect their wives because they felt powerless or they knew they were powerless. Other slaves responded by killing the slave master or overseer or any white man who violated his wife. So I'm saying that to say that was a situation that many whites proceeded with caution because they knew they wouldn't be able to get away scot-free by violating a man's wife, no matter if he's a slave or not. Now, the most depressing thing about having a family that no slave could avoid was the fact that he could not escape the possibility of his family being broken up. And this is what most, especially the men, this is what most men try to avoid in slavery. They try to avoid their families being broken up, and or being sold away from their family, or their families being sold away from them. If I recall, the old minstrel show song, "Oh Susanna," this is a song that is played in kid cartoons. This is played in nursery rhymes. Um, "Oh Susanna" is a song about a slave who had to leave his wife. He was being sold. And if I'm not mistaken, in the song, he said he was going to Alabama. And he was just telling his wife to not be sad about the situation, and that he'll try to escape that plantation and come back to her, or reunite with her, again at one point in their lives. And I found that funny that whites would sit around and think this was entertainment. This was entertainment for them. Our struggles, our families being broken up, this was entertainment to them. So this is something key to note, that within the family, although some slave masters allowed families because they felt it exercised a means of docility or submissiveness, others didn't care and they broke families up. That's key to note. Now, when it comes to children, what was the life of slave children like within the family? Most slave masters gave the parents complete control of their children, and they did this to relieve themselves of the responsibility of caring for the children. So most slave owners would have their slaves chastise their children for them. Now, some would chastise the children, but in many cases they would have the parents chastise the children. It's key to note that when we look at an institution like slavery, no matter if we're looking at the family, we're looking at slave culture, we have to understand that it's a topic that can't be generalized. You have to look at it from different perspectives and different points of view, because every plantation wasn't the same. Now, slave infants, they were neglected. Most owners gave the mother a couple days to recover after pregnancy. And then, some gave a couple weeks. Then you had some who would actually work the child, or nursing the child within the mother's schedule. So like I said, it just depended upon the plantation. But for the most part, in many cases, slave infants were neglected and they were malnutrition, and they were either left with, old female slaves who were, didn't know that they knew how to care for the child, but they were becoming more senile in their older age, or they were often left with white overseers who just didn't care at all. So the slave infant mortality rate was extremely high on most plantations. But most slave children enjoyed childhood. Most slave children didn't know they were slaves until they got about 13. And then you had most slave children who learned of their condition as soon as they were able to understand life, understand their environment, things that were going on around them. But in early childhood, they were showered with love by their parents and grandparents. And as I mentioned earlier, their grandparents would teach them about Africa. So as you see, that link to African culture never died out. It never went away. Now, although while some slave children were able to enjoy a childhood for the most part until the age of 13 or 14, and then this is when they would be put to work. And they were also taught about slavery from their parents on how to survive and things like that. Many slave children did not enjoy a childhood. From the moment when they were able to realize who they were, they knew that they were in slavery. And they were also bullied and tortured by their white playmates. Because we have to remember that most masters, they gave their children a slave, like how you would give a child a puppy or a cat or a bird. They gave their child a whole human being, a whole person. And these white playmates would bully them and torture them. Some slave children were beat by planters, overseers, or they witnessed their relatives, their own parents, or they witnessed other slaves be, brutalated and mutilated and, beat and terrorized. So it just depended on the plantation of how the slave's life was. Now, most parents taught their children how to survive bondage. The most important thing they were taught is to hold their tongue, to not talk so much. Two reasons why. One reason is because they didn't want their child to be murdered for being what planters, overseers, and patrolmen called saucy niggers. They didn't want their children to be, known as that. So they would teach their children to, for the most part, obey, but not fully submit. Obey when you need to, but never fully submit. See, these are the little things that we were taught in slavery. But we tend to think that, when I say taught, I mean taught by each other, by our parents or by other slaves. We think that everybody, every African who was enslaved was just so submissive and hopeless and gave up and weak. That was never the case. But they were taught to obey, but not fully submit. So that's the first reason. Second reason is that a lot of slave masters use the children to spy on slaves in the quarters. It's pretty much now what we see within the school systems. How, these white teachers claim they care so much about the black student, and they get them along and they corner them in classrooms and they ask them questions about, is mommy smoking? Is daddy smoking? They ask these questions to disrupt and destroy black families. So I found that connect. I had to make that connection to, the 21st century. Wrapping up here, even though slave children were taught by their, I said this already, that even though they were taught by their parents to obey, they were not taught to be fully submissive. Children were often, now it's key to note that most slave children were taught to fight their masters, overseers, or any white man who violated their relatives, such as a mother, a sister, a grandmother, an aunt. And the slave mother and father were highly respected by their children no matter what. So even in such a degraded state, even when the black man didn't have any power over his family still valued him and respected him. Even when the black woman in most cases was dehumanized or degraded in front of her family, they still held her in a high regard. And most children were taught. They were taught by their parents. Most sons in slavery were taught by their fathers. In the book, one father in a narrative, I think it was William Wells. No, I mean William Webb, not William Wells Brown, but William Webb. I think it was William Webb who said that his father taught him to fight a slave owner, overseer to the death in regards to his mother. He taught him to, if anybody was to violate your mother, you fight them to the death. So wrapping up here, I want to get back to something that I said earlier. When we look at how slavery impacted African people, we have to look at the response to it. What was the African response? and there were two responses. The overall response was no matter what, you were gonna have some type of shock from enslavement. You were gonna have fixed melancholy one way or another. You were gonna be traumatized either way. But were you gonna be in such a state of fixed melancholy to the point where you gave up on life? Or are you gonna be driven to the point where it's like, I'm gonna fight to the end no matter what? With that being said, the topic of slavery itself, African enslavement, in the New World, in the United States, it has to be re-examined over and over again because slavery cannot be generalized to just one plantation. And for the most part, this is what most white historians have done. They have generalized slavery down to one plantation. Every plantation was different. Every plantation was different. I like to say that the plantations were like going to different cities or different states. You may go to Atlanta and it's different from Seattle. You may go to Los Angeles and it's different from Chicago. And this is how plantations were. Every plantation differed. Some things that were allowed on one plantation were not allowed on another plantation. And in the end, though, I would like to say that as African people, it's important that we highlight our struggle. We shouldn't be ashamed of the fact that, we were held in enslavement, but we should look at it from a point of view that we survived it. And since we did, and we have proof we survived it. I'm here. God King Darrell is here. A lot of us, all of us are here. The 50 million black people in America, we're here. So with that being said, we must look and say, how am I able to still be here? If my ancestors were so-called weak and submissive, why am I still here? Different plantations, different rules, different outcomes. We must continue to study slavery to understand why we think the way we think as black people in America, why we act the way we act as black people in America, and why we live the way we live. So with that being said, during Black History Month, on the Earth Day of the Honorable Frederick Douglass, we must continue to build ourselves, especially build our children. Thank you, Transatlantic. Thank you, Brother God King Darrell. And that's the end of my lecture.